G'day, and welcome to the Sea Creatures podcast, a show all about the amazing animals that live beneath the waves. Each episode, we chat about a specific sea creature with a guest who has spent time and interacted with this ocean animal. Our guests range from marine biologists to divers to underwater photographers, citizen scientists, and people that have an intense passion for marine life. My name is Matt Testoni, and I'm all of the above. And joining me for this episode of the Sea Creatures podcast is Ashley Miskelly, and he's a sea urchin taxonomist. And we're going to be talking all about sea urchins. Welcome to the show, Ashley.
Thanks, Matt. Glad to be here.
So you run a sea urchin museum, and when I kind of look up sea urchins and think about sea urchins, your name is definitely at the top of the list. Before we get into what a sea urchin is, tell us how or why you have such a passion for sea urchins.
I think the reason I am so passionate about it is because, firstly, they're very attractive looking things. If you get the sea urchin in its natural environment, they're an amazing structures of spines, pedicellariae, which are the little poison glands beneath the spines. Their 5-ray symmetry stands out, and in some instances, the colour and sculpture can be seen, between the spines, when they're living. But when the thing is actually dead, the sea urchin test, as it's called, which is like the skeleton, is just as incredible. I mean, it looks totally different to the live animal, but you've got this colourful, banded, striped, sometimes zigzags and diamonds present on the surface of the sea urchin test. So, who couldn't be attracted to that in nature? And I think it goes back to when, we're sort of young children and we go to the beach and discover these things for the first time, and they get stuck in your mind and you think, wow, that's really something that I like. And years later, you follow up on it, which is what happened with me. And, there's just no stopping the interest. You just, you can't get bored of it, I suppose, because there's always something new to find and new to discover, especially when you're a diver or a beachcomber or a scientist. And there's a lot in it. They're also very functional creatures. They help to control the algae. They help to clean the sand in the environment, which is like the bilaterally symmetrical urchins, like your sand dollars and heart urchins. Which we don't really see that often, but if you do go subtidally, you can see them on the sand. Or if after a storm they get washed up on the beach, you can observe those, and they've got this incredible, as I said, bilaterally symmetrical patterns on them as well. They're also not as well known as perhaps mollusks, seashells and things like that. Certainly fewer species worldwide. But just at the moment, there's a big flurry of interest worldwide with sea urchins. And, as you say, I'm kind of at the top of the list. Yeah, and I'm more than happy to help share the experience. And that's what it's all about, to get it all out there and enjoy it and see the beauty of these things and kind of take it away from boring science, as I call it. Yeah, I mean, they're interesting animals, so let's make them interesting.
Yeah, and especially I think I just remember the first kind of times I've seen sea urchins was beachcombing, and their shells are amazing. And you look at a normal kind of shell that washes up, their test, their outer skin. You look at a normal shell that kind of washes up and you're like, oh yeah, that's pretty. There's about 1,000 of them. But you find a piece of sea urchin and you're like, wow, that is really cool. And the patterns are amazing, as you said. So tell us, what is a sea urchin exactly?
Okay, sea urchins are exclusively marine invertebrates. They, unlike things like mollusks and other life, they don't actually live in fresh water. They've got a very low tolerance to, poor salinity. So you won't find them in, brackish water up near estuaries and, way up the Parramatta River, for example. They have a 5-ray radial symmetry. They have a water vascular system. And they actually have a skin layer, which isn't very evident when you pick one up, but it is there. And they're part of the echinoderms. When echinoderms usually have spines, tube feet, pedicellariae, plates or ossicles, and don't have a brain or a nervous system either. So in a way, they're quite simple. And if you were to open one up, you pretty much find a lot of them, urchins that is, filled with water. And they also have 5 gonads as well, which, when it's spawning time, they tend to get more swollen. So in a sense, they're kind of simple animals. The spines are used for protection. They also use for locomotion, also for sort of wedging themselves in habitat to kind of stop themselves from being dislodged in sort of surge zones. And some of them have modified spines to actually dig. And so they're sort of flat-tipped or modified. There is an urchin around Sydney, which we find called the pencil urchin. That's Philocanthus parvispinus, which has very big, thick pencil spines. It's quite a primitive design. they've pretty much remained unchanged for millions of years. And so obviously a very successful group of urchins. But, if you ever find one of those that's recently died and the spines have fallen off, and it's one of the most incredible things of nature. It's so perfect, so symmetrical. You have the little tubercles where the spines articulate, and they occur in 20 rows, and they just look fantastic. It's an amazing thing. You couldn't help but not be taken in by the natural beauty of the sea urchin test of a pencil urchin.
Yeah, because pencil urchins, if you think of kind of an underwater landmine from like one of the war movies or something, that's what I always think of a pencil urchin as. And I remember actually diving with one in Sydney Harbour in Mossman. And afterwards I came out and there was actually a whole flurry on the pier because someone had called the police claiming that there was an unexploded mine underwater. And
yes, I remember that.
A pencil urchin.
Yes, yeah. And that's interesting because I remember that. I think it was in the Mossman Daily, wasn't it? Reported. And they didn't know what it was. But yes, they do look like landmines, I have to say, unexploded landmines, particularly a large one. And they're not generally that large. Subtidally, you tend to get them larger. I also can recall, I think it was in a paper in the UK, they found Echinocardium caudatum, which is a very common heart urchin in temperate seas around the world. And anyway, these things had washed ashore, and they thought they were aliens of some description because, of course, they burrow under the sand up to 30 centimetres and you don't really see them very often. So, a beachcomber may, only see this sort of thing a few times in their life. So they didn't know what they were because, they were symmetrical and they looked a bit strange and unusual. They didn't look like a seed or an egg or anything. They looked odd to them. And, naturally they thought they were something a bit alien. So... yeah, but I had a bit of a laugh at that one as well, as well as the landmine one.
And so you just mentioned that there's actually burrowing urchins. So they use their spines to burrow, and then they totally submerge beneath the sand?
Yeah, so basically sea urchins can be divided into, two rough kind of a group. So we call them regular sea urchins. So that includes the radially symmetrical ones, and irregular sea urchins. So that includes the heart urchins and the sand dollars. And the heart urchins, those two are bilaterally symmetrical. So with the heart urchins and sand dollars, they actually don't live on rocky substrates like the regular ones do. And by the way, regular ones also can live on sand and different environments too, but they don't burrow. So a heart urchin has specialized morphology to allow it to dig in mud and sand and shell grit and coralline sand and even gravel, depending on the different sorts of morphological features that it's evolved. So, for example, Echinocardium caudatum is very efficient in its burrowing technique and also being able to build a little sanitary funnel up to the water from up to 20 centimetres deep in the sand. So it slowly moves along in the sand and constructs this funnel and also brings in freshly oxygenated seawater so it can breathe in a fairly confined space. So they've evolved incredible little things over time. They also have these things called fascioles. And fascioles are like little pathways that occur on the top surface of heart urchins and also just below the anus. There's one called a subanal fasciole, the peripetalous fasciole, and they also have lateral fascioles and endopetalous fascioles in some different groups. And they're all responsible for helping the urchins maintain an existence in a burrow in sand. They don't all burrow though. There's some other ones around here, for example, Lavinia elongata, which is a tropical one, that has an endopetalous fasciole, but it doesn't have a peripetalous, so it doesn't really burrow very deeply. You can actually see the protective spines arch up in the sand. And then you've got Eupatagus valencien's eye, which is a Victorian and Tasmanian heart urchin, and that one doesn't burrow very deeply either. With the sand dollars, they actually don't burrow too deep. They're just sitting on the top of the sand with a thin veneer of sand over the top of them. So they extract edible particles from the sand and pass them to the mouth. The difference between sand dollars and heart urchins is sand dollars actually have teeth. So they actually crush the sand as they swallow it. But heart urchins are sediment swallowers, so they ingest almost continuously the sand that they have in their burrow and just pass out the clean sand to the environment. So both those types are important because they actually clean the sea floor like little vacuum cleaners. Yeah, and actually things like Echinocardium, there's another species locally in Sydney Harbour called Metalia angustus, And there's another one, Brissus agassizii, which also extends to Victoria. And those ones can be found in quite large numbers, if you're prepared to do a bit of digging, I suppose. But when you do find one, you generally find them in quite large numbers. And they're quite large species as well. Metalia and Brissus get up to, say, 170 millimeters long. So they're not small creatures. They're quite large. Yeah, if you actually open one up, you'd see there's probably, I think, up to around about 300 or 400 grams of sand in the gut at any one time.
Wow.
So they do actually...
It takes in that sand and then it spits it out.
Yeah, it just passes it out the back end, yeah. So, yeah, they're quite able to swallow large amounts of sediment. So, yeah, they're quite interesting things. But as I said, you have to really burrow, dig for these things to be able to see them and observe them and study them, because they don't, for example, come out at night and go foraging. They're always in their burrows. And so you really have to sort of hone in on a little depression in the sand and fan the sand away, and then you'll actually find often a heart urchin under there.
Oh, wow.
They're fascinating.
Yeah, that's really cool. So those urchins eat sand or clean sand. What do other urchins eat? And what are some of the weirdest things they eat? Because I know they do eat a few things you don't expect.
Yeah, they do actually. Well, getting back to the regular sea urchin, so that's the type that we're all familiar with, that, have 5-row symmetry, that the big, black spine ones or orange spine ones. So they're basically algae feeders and detrital feeders. Some of the ones that live on the, a bit more accessible, so just subtidal, like Centrostephanus rogersi, that's more of a macroalgal feeder, so it'll scrape small amounts of algae from large boulders. Then you get Holopneustes porosissimus, Holopneustes inflatus, and Holopneustes purpurescens. They're the ones that are very spherical, very ball-shaped ones, and they tend to be suspension feeders. And by that, what I mean is they live in the kelp fronds or seagrass fronds. So they actually scrape the surface and also eat the kelp and seagrass. They're actually quite a specialised form, those. In Victoria, you get Amblyneustes. So you get Amblyneustes pechystus, Amblyneustes formosus on the odd occasion, and Amblyneustes ovum. So they're, again, more towards sheltered bays, but they're algal feeders. And those belong to a group called the temnopleurids. Now, temnopleurids are lovely sculptured tested sea urchins. Australia has quite a unique fauna of them, and many of them are endemic to southern Australia. So as far as the other things that temnopleurids eat, there's also the type that they don't actually live on rocks and they don't live in suspension environment. They live on the sea floor and they actually crawl around looking for detritus. And some of them actually camouflage the top surface with rocks and bits of shell and even bits of broken glass, just to sort of camouflage themselves. There's a few species locally, Salmaciella and Salmachus, two of them. They have fairly longer spines around the mouth and the bottom surface, and they're spatulate tipped. So having a flat tip enables them to actually crawl over the sediment. And as they do, they sort of pick around for little edible particles. And as I said before, they actually pass some of those to the top surface to camouflage. So the temnopleurids are quite an interesting little bunch. If you think of the latitude below Sydney, travelling south to Victoria, across to South Australia and all the way up to Perth, there's quite a range of temnopleurids that are endemic to Australia, and they don't occur anywhere else. So we have this amazing, unique fauna of southern Australian temnopleurids. And some of them get quite complex, particularly the genus Amblyneustes. It always causes a bit of confusion. But, these days with DNA sequencing and, molecular work, we are working through these things. And we've actually realised with some of the other urchins, they're not actually temnopleurids, but they're still local. We've actually split them into separate species, something that was long suspected years ago, but it's good to see it's happened.
Oh, cool. And I guess that just shows how amazing. So the Great Southern Reef is something I talk about a lot. And that goes from like Sydney to Perth. And it just shows you that, the Great Barrier Reef is amazing, but the Great Southern Reef, I think, is just as cool and has just as much amazing diversity in it.
Yeah, personally, from my own experience, I actually prefer the southern waters more. I think they're a lot more interesting and beautiful. I mean, I've been to the Barrier Reef many times and up to north of that, the Coral Sea, and beautiful. But as far as the diversity of echinoderms goes, I think we're Yeah, I think I find it a lot more interesting. For example, in the 20 or 25 years I've been diving around Sydney, I've actually recorded 53 sea urchin species, and that's a really large number. Now, some of those were one-offs, and some of them were things that actually come down in the East Australian current as larvae, and then they grow, and then they die off, and then they come down again, and you get a new recruitment. But interestingly, some of those that we've seen since around 2011, when the winter temperatures don't get so cold anymore, have been able to, sustain a population and breed, which is quite interesting for me because, back in the 90s, the winter temperatures would go down to about 13 degrees around sort of Port Jackson. But now 17 degrees is about what we kind of experience now. You don't really get it much less than that. Yeah, so those extra few degrees have meant that the tropical stuff can survive. Yeah.
Yeah, it's changing the ecology. And I think Sydney especially is kind of one of the points on the coast I feel like is a differentiation. It's where sea dragons kind of start. It's where a lot of seagrasses kind of border and stuff. So I guess that's kind of moving south as the climate changes, unfortunately. But you mentioned that you saw 50 species or 53 species just in Sydney. Now, I think there's about 950 species. So that means that 5% of urchins worldwide can be found in Sydney. That's crazy.
Yeah, that's right. It's an enormous amount. I mean, it rivals the Great Barrier Reef. If I was to spend probably a year up in, Lizard Island, which is quite a diverse area for urchins, I don't know if I would even get 53 in that time period. Yeah, it is. It is a very interesting place. I mean, part of the reason is you've got a range of habitats. It's not just rocks where people are familiar with seeing urchins. There's kelp forests, not big ones, but they're there. There's large boulders. You have shell grit. You have seagrass. You have very coarse shell grit because some heart urchins prefer very coarse substrates. For example, Protonasta australis has to live in that sort of shell grit to be able to breathe properly. Metalia also loves it too. So it's interesting because when you find Metalia or Brissus in this coarse shell environment, and then you sort of move a little bit there's a sand ridge in the harbour which becomes suddenly a lot more fine in its consistency, you don't find them anymore. It just stops. So they really enjoy a type of sediment grade. So yeah, Sydney Harbour is diverse in its habitat, and there's a whole bunch of algae, and there's probably a whole lot of things that I don't even understand down there that they're liking, and that's why they stay. I mean, we never really will know it all, but it's good to record everything that I have found and in that time period, because I guess it's a bit of a benchmark to compare for years to come when the ocean temperatures do change and the habitat changes and whatever else is about to come in decades from now. And actually, I had no idea there was that amount of diversity here when I first started going to the Australian Museum back in the late 80s to identify some of the things I'd found. And I remember saying to one of the scientists there, I said, how far up the harbour towards, say, Lane Cove River do sea urchins actually still exist? And he goes, well, no one's ever really looked that far up. And I said, oh really? So I thought, well, that was something that I just couldn't get out of my mind. I thought I'd love to be able to dive and see what really is down there and record it. So that's kind of what I did years later, maybe 5 or 6 later after I spoke to him. Yeah, I mean, 53 species later, it's incredible. And, that's only 2 areas in Sydney. So it's really a small part of Sydney Harbour from around about Neilson Park swimming enclosure to the Heads, and also Botany Bay from Cornell across to La Perouse. So it's really not a large area that I've studied, but it's a good area because the habitats are there.
Yeah, I mean, it always blows my mind that on the shore of one of the biggest city in Australia, there is such amazing diversity and abundance of marine life. It's really incredible.
Yeah, definitely. And especially when the general consensus that it's not so clean down there, because I said, well, actually, Sydney-siders do really look after their environment. I mean, it's actually very clean down there. I think they get a perception that there's old cars and old tyres and rubbish down there from accumulation of many years of things flooding down from the Parramatta River or whatever. But no, not really. That's not my experience at all. And it's great. I mean, that's why all these things can live.
Yeah. So you've dived with all these urchins. What's the coolest thing or one of the most interesting things you've seen whilst you've been diving with urchins?
Oh wow, there's so many, but I'll just pick a few experiences that stand out. One is probably something that I found, or it'd have to be about 20 years ago. It's called Schizasta portjacksinensis, and it's only known from 4 specimens found in Port Jackson. I found a damaged one and an intact one. It was obviously fresh dead, sitting on the seafloor. And it's a heart urchin with a very deep furrow at the front, and that's used for burrowing in muds. And I did actually find it sitting on mud at fairly deep water from memory. I think it was about 18 meters. And it has 2 little, what they call petals, 2 little tiny ones. And then it has 2 lyre-shaped petals at the other end. And it's just a spectacular looking thing. The Schizastridae are known for their unusual beauty, and they do have lyre-shaped petals and these 2 little tiny petals at the other end. So to find something that was so rare and never found it again, and it's only known from Port Jackson, was pretty exciting. It was only discovered in 1980 and named in 1980. So since that time, only 4. I think there's a holotype and 1 paratype, and the 2 that I found, and that's all that's known. Then there's a time where, this is going back probably 5 or 6 years ago, as I've explained, I've been looking at Sydney Harbour for a very long time. And then I did 5 consecutive dives. Some of them were in Sydney Harbour and some of them were in Botany Bay. And on each dive, I found Spatagobrissus incus, which is a fairly recently described sea urchin back in 1990 that was known from Spencer Gulf and Glennie Island in Victoria. So to have a southern Australian endemic species found so far north, and I'd never found it before then, and I've never found it after, in 5 consecutive dives, is almost unexplainable. I can't really explain that at all. I mean, you could say it could have been ballast water, but I think that's a possibility if it was in one of those localities. But because it was in 2, unless the same boat just disposed of a lot of water in both environments, I don't know. Because the southern currents don't really come north from that far south. They tend to travel from the tropics further down. So, but that was very exciting. I mean, there are very few specimens known of that regardless. You know, I have some in my scientific collection from Spencer Gulf, and then there's the original ones that were found, you know, back in the early 1990s. So that was very special to me. And then there's another one, which is a brand new species that I found actually in Vaucluse Bay. It's a very large urchin. It's a heart urchin. It was bright red, and I was just digging in the sand at about 3 meters deep, and I unearthed this thing that is totally new to science, and it's about 180 millimeters long. So it's one of Australia's largest heart urchins. It's really big. But having said that, this thing actually, over the years, I've discovered it actually occurs in the Philippines as well. And I believe there's one specimen in either the Queensland Museum collection or the Western Australian Museum collection that is the same thing. So it's probably more widespread, but it still hasn't been named. So there's some of the things. There's many, many experiences, but there are 3 that stick out for me because they were quite exciting.
Yeah, I think seeing any rare animal underwater is a cool experience, and especially if you have such a wealth of knowledge of urchins like you do, seeing one you've never seen before, I could imagine myself just laughing and cheering underwater for an experience like that. So,
well, you do tend to do that. You sort of go woohoo, and all these bubbles sort of float up to the surface. But it's okay because there's nobody around to feel embarrassed about.
Oh, and so we'll say a couple of cool facts about urchins. So you mentioned this earlier, and this was going to be like one cool fact, but you mentioned that they're symmetrical, but 5-fold symmetrical. I want to hear a little bit more about the fact that they're like 5-way symmetrical.
Yeah, so they're 5-way symmetrical. They don't actually have a preferred orientation, if you like. So if you place a regular sea urchin, for example, in a tray with seawater, it doesn't really, have a preferred front or backwards or side movement. It's just random. It can go anywhere. I guess if you sort of prompt it to go one direction, it just will. So yeah, they can kind of turn any old direction. But yeah, I mean, it's obviously a very functional design because it's lasted for so many millions of years, pretty much unaltered. It's a basic design anyway.
Yeah, because I just have to, think when you dissect an urchin or when you open an urchin up or you look at its anatomy, to think that it's symmetrical in 5 ways, that's just really unique within the animal kingdom. And it's just amazing. I can't even kind of, imagine if a human being was symmetrical in 5 ways. I think it would be hilarious, like 5 legs, 5 eyes. Yeah, something from a sci-fi movie. But so that was my kind of cool fact. Have you got a cool fact for us?
Yeah, I do actually. Interestingly, they're not always 5-ray symmetry. I have to say, you do get these mutations. Yeah, you do. And some species are more prone to it than others. So, for example, if you went to a beach after a big storm and you looked at a whole bunch of Holopneustes inflatus that washed up, you can actually count 4 or 6 part symmetry. Now, 6-part symmetry is very, very rare. I'm sort of estimating within that species, it's more like 1 in about 3,000, because in the many, many years I've observed that species locally, I've found about 3 or 4. So, it's 33 years of, constantly looking at these things, and I've found 3 or 4, and one was broken, but it's quite a large one. As far as 4-ray symmetry goes, it's a little bit more common. For example, there's a white version of Heliosidaris erythrogramma, which occurs in southern Australia, where the 4-ray symmetry seems to be a little bit more common, not than the 5, but it's a little bit more common than it should be, if you like, because the green variety of it here in Sydney, I've only ever found 2 in my whole life. And I have seen a lot of dead ones washed in, and I do actually check them because I have a little display here based on that. So interestingly, when I say 4-ray symmetry, everything is 4 or everything is 6. So you have 6 teeth or 4 teeth. They have 4 ambulacra and 4 interambulacra. They have 4 genital plates. They have 4 ocular plates, and so it goes on. Yeah, the whole body plan is based on 4 or 6. And it's interesting because, you look at it and it's perfectly round like it should be, but you have a closer look and you go, oh no, it's actually totally different.
Wow.
Symmetry's just, yeah.
Do you know what causes that?
Look, I just think it's not an environmental thing. I think it's just a genetic fault. And it's a bit like having a 4-leaf clover, for example.
Yeah.
And sometimes you get 5. I remember counting them as a kid. Go, oh, that's a bit unusual. Yeah.
Oh, so we're almost to the end now, but I want to ask one more question, and I'm going to kind of ask it to myself first, which is, what is your favorite urchin? And my favorite urchin is definitely, and I'm after a few little facts if you know any, is definitely a fire urchin where the Coleman shrimp live on top. Have you seen fire urchins before?
Probably Astropyga radiata from the tropics, which is really radiant, sort of, it's got blue dots on it and sort of red, like fiery red colouring on the skin.
That's the one. Yeah. What kind of urchin is that?
It belongs to a group called the diadematids. So they've usually got needle spines. Test is, in that one particularly, it's very, very light. It's paper thin. They have hollow spines. So if you ever break a spine, they're quite hollow. The secondary spines of those are quite a bit of a hazard because the barbs can really stick in you and very, very difficult to remove. Yeah, you've got to be very careful with those. So they include the needle spine urchins that are seen mainly in the tropics. So Diadema setosum, Savinii. There is actually one from Byron Bay to Montague Island called Palmeri, which has, it actually looks like the fire urchin as well, but it's very, very red, fluorescent red almost body, especially if you take a flash photo of it underwater. Yeah, they're quite interesting, and they've got perforate tubercles as well. So the little bumps that the spines articulate on have little holes in the middle. So they're quite easy to differentiate from the other groups. So, yeah, I can see why that would be your favourite. They're incredible and beautifully coloured and striped and banded. And as you say, the Coleman shrimp's found on it. So commensal crabs and shrimps can be found on diadematids, just sort of picking around there. Yeah, interesting.
They're just such a vibrant red, and they really do look like they're almost on fire. When I first saw one, I was just blown away. I didn't even care that they were all covered in little tiny zebra-like shrimp. But it's just a beautiful animal. So what's your favorite urchin?
Well, it's probably a toss-up between 2. There's a little, very rare, endemic, almost southern Western Australian species called Microcyphus compsus. Now, this thing, it's only small. It only grows to probably around about, I'm guessing about 25 millimeters diameter. But when the spines are not on it, so if you might find a dead test diving on the sea floor, they have these incredibly distinct red zigzags. There's 5 of them. And they're really like somebody's got a marker pen and just drawn them on there. And then the peripherous zones, which is where the tube feet protrude from, are all light pink. And then they've got white tubercles, for the spines that are part of the plates. And everything's arranged in a regular series. So they're one of the most beautiful things you could possibly imagine. So that's something called Microcyphus compsus. And I suppose the other one, really, I have to say, is Philocanthus irregularis. And that's a Western Australian, Southern Australian, or South Australian, I should say, endemic species, which grows really large for a pencil urchin. But I was given a specimen many years ago, and it's unusually tall and unusually perfect and unusually large. So I find this thing just something to marvel at. I've had it for a number of years, and it really is one of the most beautiful things and perfect things I've ever seen. The structure, the design, the functionality, and everything about it is just incredible. It's just a miracle of nature, I think.
Wow.
So
how big is it?
That one would probably be, I'm guessing, around about maybe 120 millimeters diameter. Yeah.
Wow, that's a big urchin. With the spines, how big would the spines be? And how big is the whole animal?
Yeah, well, if you add the spines, you're probably adding an extra, quite a lot actually. Maybe the spines would be probably 100 millimeters long. They're quite big things. So yeah, adding an extra 200 mils to that. So yeah, it's quite a big landmine.
Yeah, it would look just like one, wouldn't it?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it looks very similar to the Eastern Australian one, Philocanthus parvispinus. There's only a few small differences between them, and it's about the granularity of the collar of the spine. So really, it's very similar, but they do grow much bigger over there. Yeah. I mean, the thing is, with a lot of siderids, as we call them, like pencil urchins belong to the Sidaridae, once you remove the spines, they all look fairly similar. So you have to really, to differentiate the species, you have to really look closely at the spine morphology. But I find them fascinating. I mean, they've got more, the siderids have more crazy looking structures in the spines than any other group. Some of them are trumpet shaped, they're football shaped. They look like feathers. They look like dendrites or tree branches. They look like clubs. And some of them are very, very thorny as well and stunted. It just goes on forever. They're a really incredible group.
Wow.
Down in Victoria, you get Goniosidaris, tuberia, and there's another very similar one called Impressa. They're quite incredible. They're very, very thorny spines, and they tend to attract a lot of marine growth to camouflage themselves. But sometimes they're a little bit cleaner, and you pick them up and you think, wow, they incredible looking thing, It looks like it's actually going to kill you, but it won't. They're quite harmless.
Yeah. Cool. Well, that kind of brings us to the end of our sea urchin episode. But if anyone wants to, because I know, and this is one thing you need to tell us about quickly as well before the end, if anyone wants to see your stuff, I know you have a museum as well. So tell us, what's the best way to see the urchins and kind of interact with them, in your museum, or where should people go online, or what should they do? What kind of books have you got and so forth?
Well, the best way to get in contact with me, I'd love to hear from people and to get in touch with them if they're interested in urchins. I'm actually in Currajong in New South Wales, which is at the foothills of the Blue Mountains. And I have a 400 square metre museum and gallery. It's also a laboratory. So I basically have tours here. And the tours usually go for 1.5 to 2 hours. And that's really cutting it pretty fine because there's usually a lot of interest in what I have here. There's 21 theme cabinets to do with many different aspects of sea urchins in the museum. There's an 8-metre worldwide biodiversity gallery of the world's sea urchins, which probably actually includes around about 400 species. So that's an enormous amount of beautiful sea urchin specimens here. You can contact me probably best by email, which is seaurchins1@optusnet.com.au, or just see my Instagram page, which is just Ashley Miskelly. Or if you want to have a look at the book, which is also absolutely recommended, if you love the colour and symmetry, design and science and everything else about urchins, my coffee table book, Sea Urchins of the World, is the one that you should be looking at. And you can actually order that on seaurchins.net.au. So either of those ways, you'll get in touch with me, and I'd love to hear from people who have the interest or even want to learn something and don't know much about it. That's okay. This is the place to come. So I'd love to have people up here. It's become very popular as well. So, but I'd have to make a booking and certainly can fit people in if they're sick of staying at home like we have been for a number of months. It's good to get out and have a look.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, well, next time I'm up in Sydney, I'll definitely be checking out the museum. But thanks for being. Sea Creatures podcast is hosted, produced, and edited by myself, Matt Testoni. You can see more of my photography on Instagram, Matt_Testoni_photography, and webpage emptyunderwatermedia.com. If you've liked the podcast, please subscribe, leave a review, and visit our Patreon account, patreon.com/SeaCreaturesPodcast, which helps us with funding the show. Production assistance by George McGrath, and music by Dan Musil and his amazing slide guitar. Tune in next time to hear all about a few different seabirds with marine biologist Tom Heine. It's been the Sea Creatures podcast. Over and out.